Welcome to 247 Real Talk. I'm your host, Julian Perry, and once again, I'm here with you for another week of riveting episodes. I hope that you enjoy. It's my pleasure to be here with you. I'm recording this episode for this week. It is Wednesday, March 15th, looking at the clock behind my camera, about 7 minutes before 9 p.m. I hope you had a great week. And as I bring this episode to you this week, it wasn't intentional, but it's a continuation of last week and talking about justice denied. In terms of justice denied, it was a pretty heavy, pretty rough week. So come back in a few minutes, join me, and we'll talk more about it. All right, and I'm back, and once again, thank you for joining me for another episode of the 247 Real Talk podcast. Now, last week, I had an episode, and I spoke about Arthur, let me get the name right, and I'll be doing a bit of reading here tonight, so if you who look at the YouTube video, you see me with my head down at times, understand there's a lot of material that I want to share with you in a very short span of time tonight. The episode last week was for Arthur Brown Jr. Arthur Brown had spent, I think, 30 years in prison, was on death row. The Texas Defender Service took up his case in 2020 and found incredible inconsistencies, incredible sets of flaws, withheld evidence, enough to exonerate him, even to the point where they had evidence showing that someone else committed the crime. And when I spoke with you last week, I recorded on Wednesday, as most of the times I do, and I said to you when an episode aired on last Friday, which was March 10th, that there's a possibility that at that point when you heard the episode and you saw the episode, that Arthur Brown would be dead. I was hoping for something different. Unfortunately, it didn't help. So I signed a petition with the Texas Defender Service, hoping to get enough signatures to convince the judge to stay the execution. On Friday, I got an email from the Texas Defender Service that I'd like to read to you. It says, "Dear friends, as the executive director of Texas Defender Service, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your incredible advocacy on behalf of Arthur Brown Jr. You and over 10,000 others signed a petition calling for Mr. Brown's life to be saved. Your advocacy was breathtaking. But despite Mr. Brown's compelling claim of innocence and incredible legal representation by his lawyers at the Office of Capital and Forensic Writs, Texas courts refused to stop Mr. Brown's execution, to allow him the opportunity to test DNA evidence found at the crime scene. Mr. Brown was killed by the state of Texas on March 9, 2023. Mr. Brown was a black, intellectually disabled man who has claimed his innocence for 30 years. Mr. Brown's case was marred by poor police work, corrupted eyewitness testimonies and identifications, false forensic testimony, and racial bias. In January 2023, the prosecutor's office disclosed previously suppressed exculpatory evidence to Mr. Brown's lawyers at the Office of Capital and Forensic Writs, showing that other suspects, not Mr. Brown, committed the murder. We know that the death penalty carries an inherent risk of executing the innocent. Nearly 190 people, once on death row, have been exonerated in the United States, including 16 people in Texas. People with intellectual disability like Mr. Brown are especially vulnerable to a wrongful conviction. The result of the Texas court's ruling is that Mr. Brown was executed without anyone ever having the opportunity to examine DNA evidence that could have exonerated him. Last Thursday was a dark day, but the light in that darkness was the incredible advocacy of you and thousands of others around the globe who spoke up for Mr. Brown's humanity. We are infinitely grateful. With gratitude, Burke Butler, Executive Director, Texas Defender Service. Now, last Thursday, as I was driving home after work, I thought about Arthur Brown. I wasn't sure at the time. I didn't get a chance to look it up whether he had been executed or not. Matter of fact, I think I did look it up and he hadn't been executed yet. And I was wondering whether, a stay of execution would come. I did read somewhere that so far a judge had denied the stay of execution. But as I'm driving home, irony is a funny thing. I'm driving home and I'm pulling up another set of papers here now that I'm holding in my hand. And I'm in New York and I'm listening to 1010 Wins. And here's what comes up. On the news, and I actually printed out the story so I could read it to you. All this time, they really had the wrong person. Brooklyn man convicted after judge allowed false evidence. So let me read this to you. A black man who was wrongfully accused of murder and spent more than half of his life in prison is free following a review by the Brooklyn District Attorney's Conviction Review Unit. Authorities determined someone made a mistake when identifying Sheldon Thomas, then 16, as the killer of another teen in 2004. On Thursday, March 9, 2023, Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez announced that following a hearing where new findings were presented, Thomas, who today is 35, should be released from prison after spending 19 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. Allow me a second to turn the page here. Thomas was wrongfully convicted on Christmas Eve's of the Christmas Eve murder of a 14-year-old boy named Anderson Bursey, despite maintaining his innocence. A judge convicted him of murder, attempted murder, and other charges, sentencing him to 25 years to life in prison. Thomas's release comes after he served 76% of his minimum sentence. New evidence shows that a witness identified Thomas after seeing an image of another Sheldon Thomas. Let me say that to you again. I want that to sink in. New evidence shows that a witness identified Thomas after seeing an image of another Sheldon Thomas. So they took a picture of someone with the same name but a different guy and convicted this Sheldon Thomas. I think I read somewhere where the judge decided that there was some resemblance. So imagine we share the same name. There's a slight resemblance, and that's possible. There's millions of us that look alike. And the judge decides that for a crime that I committed, you go to jail because we have the same name, we look slightly alike. A judge at the time indicated the image showed enough of a resemblance. We have positive identifications, we have the identifications of certainty, but the judge at the time indicated the image showed enough resemblance. Thomas Gonzalez said, was arrested based on a witness identification of a different person with the same name. A mistake that was first concealed. Read it again. A mistake that was first concealed. We're talking about someone's life, someone's freedom, and then explained away during proceedings. The borough's top attorney said the prosecution working the trial was compromised from the very start by grave errors and lack of probable cause to arrest Mr. Thomas. The New York Times reports that while investigators noted that the two men had the same name and had addresses in the same precinct, not the same address, they had the same name and addresses in the same precinct, detectives knew early on that the persons that they had and the persons they were possibly looking for were two different people. Let's pause. You have to you have to understand the gravity of this. You have to understand how we can go about our lives doing the right thing, living a good life, and this can happen to you, and you could be your freedom can be snatched away. It can happen to you. It can happen to your parents, your siblings, your children. Detectives knew early on that the person they had and the person they were possibly looking for were two different people. In fact, the district attorney showed that the detectives had known Thomas from the community and repeatedly harassed him for months. The investigators became acquainted with the team after he was arrested for pointing a broken gun at NYPD members. The detectives locked in on Thomas when looking for the suspect in Bursey's death. Allow me to turn the page. The Brooklyn Supreme Court Judge Eric Matthew Diemek ordered him freed after the evidence was presented. When given a chance to speak, Thomas said at the hearing, "Thank you, Your Honor, for allowing this to happen. I've waited a long time." All this time, they really had the wrong person, Thomas said. The real people are still out there. Thomas also shared that he's waited a long time for this day to happen. And there's so many times that I was in my cell, I would think of this moment, what I would say, who would be there. Right now, I'm just speechless. He did not speak a lot to the press after his release, but instead left the courtroom with his grandmother. He only said to the media that he couldn't wait to get home to eat some oxtails. The police reports show 3 alleged gang members were arrested for the East Flatbush murder of Mercy and for injuring a second person. And I'm sorry that some of it is cut off here, but it says Thomas was among, I guess those people, detectives said, Thomas became associated with the crime after their office received an anonymous tip. So Thomas wasn't there with these 3 people. But after the detectives received an anonymous tip, they associated him with the crime. Even when Detective Robert Reedy brought him in and showed him the photo shared with the witness, Thomas flat out said that was not him. The judge on the case still believed the resemblance was close enough, and the testimony about the detective about the unknown callers, the district attorney said. A new prosecutor, Charles Linehan, said authorities have come to the inescapable conclusion that the police at the time made an arrest based on a photograph of a suspect that was not Thomas, adding, defendant did not look like the other Sheldon Thomas. The Conviction Review Unit discovered Thomas was denied due process at every stage, making his conviction fundamentally unfair. The unit also found the errors undermined the integrity of the entire judicial process and the defendant's resulting conviction. Thomas's case cannot and will not be retried, according to the district attorney's office. This change in events opened up old wounds for Bursey's family. Still, the victim's aunt, Edeline Bursey, spoke to the press about what happened to Thomas, calling it unfortunate, saying, justice has to be done somehow. She also remembered her nephew, stating, whoever killed him shot him 1 block away from his home, where he died on the steps. As immigrants, she said the family had come to the city for a better life, and that she was shocked to learn that he died. It's something I will never forget, she said. Gonzalez and his team were calling for the dismissal of the original indictment that moved to steal so much of Thomas's life, stopping him from going to college, learning a trade, or having a family like other men his age. Gonzalez apologized to Thomas on behalf of the system that failed him when he met him in court. This is the first time in 25 years I've seen an erroneous photo identification used as the basis for an arrest that actually went to trial, he said. We must strive to ensure fairness and integrity in every case and have the courage to correct mistakes of the past. That is what we are doing in this case, where an extensive reinvestigation by my conviction review unit revealed that it was compromised from the very start by grave errors and lack of probable cause to arrest Mr. Thomas. Since its mission was launched, the CRU has had 34 convictions vacated, including Thomas's. Now, I want you to think of that. I want you to think of when you heard my podcast and you watched my podcast last week. And I talked about Arthur Brown Jr. I talked about the fact that the courts in Texas, the governor of Texas, based on history alone, it would not have hurt them 1 second, one bit, after the Texas Defender Service got the case only last year. They only had months to work and brought up enough doubt and enough proof to show that likely someone else committed that crime to pause and not execute this man who was mentally challenged, intellectually challenged, part of a section of society of humanity that are easily swayed and usually struggle when they're caught in cases like this and likely easily pushed towards a plea or a confession in this case. It is unacceptable. You know, I talk a lot on my show about murder and the killings and shootings that must stop. Putting someone in jail when they haven't committed a crime has got to be a slow death. Imagine that. Imagine, now this man, Arthur Brown, had a significant other and kids. And they had to watch their father in jail for 30 years, knowing that he was innocent, and then watch him as they stuck a needle in him. I think they said it took 17 minutes or whatever, and he was dead. They killed him. He who was charged with murder, who was innocent, was murdered by a system that lacked enough humanity, enough common sense, enough willingness to pause and say, being judge and jury is a serious, serious responsibility. And if there's any doubt for one moment that something went wrong here, we need to pause this. Just the fact that history keeps showing over and over again. And you know, when I chose the title to my podcast last week, I said, you know, I don't want people to be offended because I said wrongful execution of black men, because this is the truth. You look at those people who have been executed, look at those people who have been exonerated after being in jail for how many years and found innocent. And they're 99.9% of them are black. To be honest with you, I haven't heard of any non-black who's been in this situation yet. I'm not saying they don't exist. I haven't heard of them. And my point is, it can't keep happening over and over and over and over again. And someone doesn't care enough, doesn't have enough love for another human being, irrespective of race, creed, or color, to pause and say, this was a heinous crime. We have lawyers and people on the side of the system fighting for this man, and the lawyers were not black lawyers. And I make that distinction because it wasn't like a conspiracy. These were lawyers who work with this service who don't care what color you are. If they feel that you're wrongly convicted, they represent you. And if these lawyers are saying, hey, we're showing you here something is wrong, we're showing you the problem, we're showing you where there's a great chance that this other person committed this crime, that should be enough to pause. That man had a family. If he convicted him of crime and he truly did murder someone, and they paused and they went through the evidence, and then they went over it the way they should, and they found out that they were wrong, and in fact he did commit the crime, that would have just delayed the execution, but you would have been a lot more in the right and a lot more sure. And the thing is that since January of this year, This evidence was brought to light that would have at least caused enough concern to stop the execution and to reopen this case and take a closer look. Here we are in March, 3 months later, and that wasn't enough time for them to say, hey, we've got enough time, let's pause this. The injection, put the needle back in. It's going to wait. It's not going to spoil. Put it back in the freezer. Let's make sure we get this right. The last thing I want to read to you here was another article that I found. It was published in July 7th, 2021, by someone, and I want to make sure I give credit. It was by Christina Carrega at CNN. And I'm going to read it to you because I think it's so important and such an important part of this problem that you have to own. I don't care who you are. I don't care what your color is. I don't care what your race is, creed. I don't care. Don't think that you are so above everything else that this can't happen to you. Imagine walking home from work one day, thinking of your family when you get home, having plans for dinner, maybe going out with your kids somewhere, and you get stopped by law enforcement. They say, put handcuffs on you for murder. And then they show you a picture and you say, that's not my picture. And at that point, you feel, okay, they got the wrong picture, so this should be over soon. And next thing you know, you're sitting in jail. And next thing you know, you go through a trial and you get convicted and you're not even sure what happened. And back then, especially if you have no money, especially if you're poor, imagine that. And then you sit there for 30 years. And then, one of these law groups that really fight for wrongful conviction decides to take up your case, and you feel hope again. You've gone through 30 years. You've lost all hope. Now you feel hope again. Someone has said to you, it's not over. We found the truth. And yet here you are laying on the gurney about to take a needle in your arm. You know how you feel as a kid where a sibling or someone else blames you for something, said that you stole the cookies when in fact you didn't. And it takes you to such an emotional place of anger, sometimes to tears. I didn't steal it. It wasn't me. He's lying. Imagine that. You feel that as a kid. Imagine someone saying that I'm going to keep you in jail for 30 years and then when I'm done, I'm going to put a needle in your hand. Even though not only you claim your innocence, but lawyers have found enough that under any normal circumstances should at least create a pause for us to be very sure. So I'm going to read this article really quickly to you. It says more than 2,800 have been wrongfully convicted in the U.S. Lawyers and advocates want to make sure they're paid their dues. John Jerome White was 19 years old when a Georgia judge sentenced him to life plus 40 years in prison for breaking into a 74-year-old woman's home and raping her. Exonerated after DNA testing years later, he walked free in a state that does not have laws on the books to compensate the wrongfully convicted upon their release from prison. I was 48 when I got out. It was rough, said White, who is now 61. If it hadn't been for my family and the people who donated their time to help me, I just don't know. A lot of things were difficult, and the state of Georgia did nothing to help me. White, who wrongly served more than 2 decades behind bars, was exonerated in 2007 after a Georgia Innocence Project stepped in and had the hair samples that helped lead to his conviction retested. Another man was charged for the crime. White is one of 2,810. Let that sink in. White is one of 2,810 men and women to date who have been wrongfully convicted of crimes in the United States, according to the National Registry of Exonerations. Now, federal lawmakers are pushing to increase the federal statute for compensating exonerees, as the Innocence Project, along with innocence organizations across the country, advocates for a universal wrongful conviction compensation law. And basically what they're saying here, like Mr. White, like Mr. Brown, if Mr. Brown wasn't executed and came out of jail, Imagine you're doing 30 years, 40 years, 50 years for a crime you had not committed. And you come out, you lost your chance at when you're younger, meeting, falling in love, getting married, having a family, getting a job, going to college, getting a trade, all these things. And then you're just released and left out in the wild after the same system, your state, your country failed you. 36 states and Washington, D.C. have laws in the books that offer compensation for exonerees, according to the Innocence Project. The federal standard to compensate those who are wrongfully convicted is a minimum of $50,000 per year of incarceration, plus an additional amount for each year spent on death row. The current statute, which was endorsed by then-President George W. Bush in 2004, also serves as a model for the states to create their own laws to compensate exonerees. Of the 36 states with compensation laws, 9 offer more than $50,000 per year, including Washington, D.C., which offers $200,000 per year, according to the Innocence Project. Last month, Democratic Representative Maxine Walls of California introduced the Justice for Exonerees Act, which would amend the federal statute to increase the compensation amount to a minimum of $70,000 per year. 18 Democrats have signed on as a co-sponsor of the bill, including Representatives Hank Johnson of Georgia and Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, both states without wrongful conviction compensation laws. Now, again, this was done in 2021, so things have changed, right? So I don't need to go through the rest of it. The point is that now they're saying, well, when we get it wrong, and this should be across the country, you need to pay me back for my life. This guy, Sheldon Thomas, he got locked up early, so he's out and he's 35 years old. He spent 19 years. So he's still got a chance in terms of living a life, but he needs a whole lot of help, right? And $50,000 a year for 19 years, right? So $50,000 by 10 years is $500,000, so just under $1 million. And guess what? That's not a lot of money for the rest of your life. He's going to have to deal with every time he goes to fill an application and it says, were you convicted? He has to say yes. Then they ask you in the same application, if you've ever seen those forms, to explain the circumstances. Could you imagine his explanation? How many employees would say, yeah, everybody says they're innocent. I'm not buying that crap. Think about it. The last thing I want to mention as I look to my side is there was a case, let me get it right. There was a case of a man that I came across. His name was Charles Edrit Ford. I think he's in a nursing home now. If I believe he's still alive. Or he was 84 in 2015, so he may or may not be alive. If he is alive, he's in his 90s. But he was in prison for 64 years. 64 years. And they figured out that he never committed the crime for which he was convicted. 64 years. And they figured out that he never committed the crime. He was nowhere near there. And according to the video I watched and the explanation of the crime, when his family members were able to say that he was somewhere far away, they were not allowed even to testify in his case. Now think about it. If he's 90-something now, this is back in the early 20s, right? 30s maybe. And so think about it for a second. That means that he was back in the time where we were still struggling with this systemic racism that even enveloped our judiciary. So people were there saying, I'll be your witness that you were not there. You were there with me and I can prove it. And you had this young black man who was accused of a crime. And so none of that evidence was allowed. It was like, let's make sure we convict him. He spent 64 years in jail. And they're very sure that he never committed the crime. Now, they're sure. So, as I said, when I started out this week, I had a different topic of discussion in mind. But The whole Arthur Brown Jr. execution, the irony, of me driving home and thinking about Arthur Brown Jr. and this case comes on the news about Sheldon Thomas spending 19 years in jail because of a picture of another Sheldon Thomas. And before the trial even begun, many knew that he wasn't the same person. He was known to the neighborhood. He was known to law enforcement in the neighborhood. He'd interacted with them as law enforcement interacts with the community. He had interacted with them partly in good and bad ways in terms of, whatever, young people are who dislike law enforcement, right? But that's not enough to lose your freedom for something you didn't do. So it seemed ironic that here am I wondering, did this man who had someone advocate on his behalf and say, here, another person did this. Here's the evidence that he did not commit this crime. I was thinking, did they go ahead and execute this man, even though anybody looking at this would say, whoa, stop. And then on the news pops up, they freed another man who spent 19 years in jail because of a picture of someone else who didn't look like him but had the same name, that lived in the same precinct but didn't have the same address. Think about that. We have to understand that no one human being is over another. It doesn't matter who you are, president, prime minister, king, commissioner of police, governor, it doesn't matter, congressman, it doesn't matter. You're a human being first. And you have to understand that when you take someone out of snatch them from the grips of their families and their lives, you create pain in their life, and you create pain in the lives of people who depend on them, who love them. They could be the breadwinner. There could be someone in the family having high hopes for them. There could be someone in love with them. I'm talking about another half, someone planning a family with them. Children looking for daddy or mommy. We cannot continue to do this and feel it's okay because it's our way at punishing someone else because of the color of their skin or because we don't like what they said. We tout ourselves all the time as the most democratic and the most free nation in the world. We talk about freedom of speech and rights. Freedom of speech and rights should have made sure that Arthur Brown Jr. was still alive and that Sheldon Thomas never went to prison. This has to stop. I love Generation Z now because Generation Z seems to me so far, and I don't think they're fooling me, they've really tossed out the color barrier. They mingle, they mix, they see each other as human beings. I can't wait till old fools like us learn from the young and the brilliant of the next generation in terms of how to live, how to treat each other, how to put your differences aside, how not to snatch someone's freedom because they argued with you or because your ego was bruised, so you're going to punish them. And you're going to use something that they never did to not just punish them with a slap on the wrist, but to destroy their lives and in the process destroy the lives of their families and every single one around them who loves them. We need to take better care of each other. I'm not saying we don't have people who commit crimes and heinous crimes in our midst. But life imprisonment, while you investigate to make sure before you think about the death penalty, it is worth making sure that the person is guilty before taking a life. Because anyone I feel who takes a life and recognizes that the person was innocent is either a criminal themselves or they're going to suffer and be haunted for the rest of their lives. God created man. Man did not create himself. Let's remember that. When we were all born, there's a point in our lives where we recognize the color of our skins and who our family members are or were. But we didn't choose that. They brought us into this world. We didn't choose to be here, and we didn't choose how we would come out of what we would look like. So understand, there's a power greater than all of us who made sure that we had the privilege to be on this earth. And our responsibility is to make sure that the love that was shown to us to breathe life and breath into us is the love that we show to others as we live this life. I hope that you will think about this really affecting situation. Say a prayer. Those of you who do, say a prayer for these families, for Arthur Brown Jr., for his better half, or his other half. I'm sorry, his other half. I always say better half. For his children, for his family members who have lost him forever. For Sheldon Thomas's family who have gotten him back, but who have punished for 19 years with pain and tears and struggles in the most egregious, I don't know the words to use, the blatant ignorance that caused him his freedom. We can't keep doing this and call ourselves human. No matter how angry you get, no matter how hateful you want to feel, love is always better than hate. Caring is always better than hate. And when those among us commit crimes, making sure that they first committed the crime and then making sure that the punishment fits the crime. We depend on lawyers and judges and law enforcement and all the people who are part of that process to do the right thing. And I call upon all of us as human beings and those in positions who make decisions. Before you put your personal feelings, your personal hate, your racism, your bias, or whatever in the way, put humanity as your first look. Put God first. And then ask yourself, am I doing the right thing? It's been a pleasure here to be here with you again for another week. Do have a safe weekend and a great week ahead. And we'll talk again next Friday. Until the next time, please take care of yourselves and each other.